Welcome, everybody. This is the 8th week of the QuantUniversity Summer School, and every Wednesday noon, we are gathering an expert panel of different people from different disciplines. We have authors, we have had entrepreneurs, we have had academics, we have had industry practitioners come down and talk about what they do and how they are kind of seeing the world of AI and machine learning and what interests them and the contributions they're making to the community, and also the way they are seeing the future of AI and machine learning. My name is Sri Krishnamurthy, and I've been the host of this. Technically, it's becoming a show, a Wednesday noon show of quants kind of getting together and talking about what they like the most. And this week, we are going to be talking about the whole area of explainability, fairness, and bias in artificial intelligence. As you know, the summer school has had two themes. One is the traditional machine learning opportunities in finance. And the second theme has been model risk and model governance. So we have two cohorts of classes going on concurrently as we speak, wherein participants from throughout the world are taking classes to get a better understanding of AI and machine learning in the industry, but also look at what are the ways in which AI and machine learning can be adopted in the industry, and also the responsible adoption of these techniques within the industry. So what I'm going to do in the next few minutes is just briefly talk about some of the key things you need to know, especially in the context of what's coming next. And then we will share the next 45 to 50 minutes with a discussion on various themes in the context of AI and machine learning. So if you can see the screen, everybody sees the screen fine? Perfect. So QuantUniversity, as most of you know, we started out as an advisory in 2013 with the intersection of data science, machine learning, and quantitative finance. We started as a consulting organization, and we've been catering to large financial asset management companies, hedge funds, some regulators, and we have also been doing a lot of research for various companies, both doing technical due diligence and also audits and understanding their problems and helping them structure various solutions. We've been primarily focused on frontier areas like AI, machine learning, and big data. These are some of the technologies I love to work with, and I'm always connected with what's happening in the academic world and also in the industry. And we kind of curate those aspects and bring in to the industry, either in the context of customized consulting offerings or through educational programs like what you're having now. We have put together various certificate programs in machine learning, artificial intelligence, model risk management, and we are kind of expanding these offerings. We primarily partner with organizations like Premier to do joint offerings with those organizations. And we're also building what's called as the Q Sandbox, which is a platform to enable rapid experimentation of machine learning experiments. And the Q Academy, wherein most of the educational content you're going to be seeing, is actually hosted on the Q Sandbox, through which we basically articulate those use cases and make them actionable through machine learning, AI, demos and applications. So for people who don't know and who are joining new, the summer school, we have primarily focused on 3 courses, and it's primarily starting with an introduction to data science with Python, and then a whole 8-week course on machine learning and AI in finance. And parallelly, we have also had a course on model risk management, primarily for machine learning models. And we are also starting the fall recruitment. We are bringing out 4 streams of courses, one in machine learning, another one in model risk and governance. The third one is a Fintech bootcamp, which is going to be 8 weeks of various themes in Fintech, another one focusing on different kinds of algorithms. And I'll be sharing the slides with you all, and you will be able to get to the links and see if you're interested in registering. We recently announced an 8-week Fintech bootcamp, which is going to be the one of the kind. So please do take a look at it. It's on the Premier's website, and you get special discounts if you go through the Premier link. But if you're interested in knowing more, just go to qfintech.splashthat.com. OK, so without further ado, I'm going to talk about what we're going to be doing today. So we have a team of experts in different disciplines. And Jennifer and I, we had a chat a few months ago, trying to see how do we put together a discussion on AI explainability and bias. So this has been a theme in the model risk management course I'm currently teaching. And we look at various facets of what does risk mean for various organizations. And with the proliferation of all the black box models and complex models out there, what does it mean for a quant or a financial industry professional to adopt these kinds of models, either in the context of decision making or to augment their decision making process? So there has been so many innovations in machine learning context, but you're also seeing that there has been interest on the ethics side of the thing, and then also trying to bring in this whole notion of responsible AI. So Jennifer and Karim they both come both from a practitioner perspective, but also from an investment perspective. So they have been looking at various innovations which are happening. Jennifer serves on some of the AI, she's at Techstars, and she's also been serving on some of the other initiatives, which I'll let Jennifer talk about. And then Karim was at Zest AI, which was primarily looking at the whole notion of underwriting and lending. And now he's also a fintech entrepreneur and investor. Anthony is working on a cool platform called Monitor. And he was telling me the other day that he kind of sees Monitor sitting next to each one of the systems out there. So I'll let him kind of discuss about the whole notion of what does monitoring mean in the context of AI and machine learning. And Slater, just to let you know, Slater, I am also an adjunct faculty at Babson College, which is kind of the sister or the brother school of Allin, I guess.
In some ways.
I also am a Babson alum, so I kind of hung out in the area wherein you were kind of studying. So Slater is the CEO of Indica.
Sorry, that's not right.
That's not right?
No, that's a very old bio. I'm an EIR at 406 Ventures, and I'm the CTO at Indico, as well as the founder of iTry.
Okay, sorry about that. I kind of, scraped the online, profile you had. And okay, I'll let you all, introduce yourselves and talk about what makes you so interested in this whole area of AI and machine learning, but also primarily focusing on responsible AI. So how about we spend a few minutes so that we can kind of go around the room and introduce ourselves and just kind of get a feel for, what areas of AI and machine learning you're focused on. So maybe Jennifer, you can kick it off, and then we can kind of go around the room.
Sure, I'll kick it off here, Sri. Thank you very much. So I'm Jennifer Jordan. I'm an early stage investor for through the middle of 2018. I was investing directly on the behalf of the state of Massachusetts, mostly in data-driven companies. One that you might know if you're in this region is Ginkgo Bioworks, but there's a number of others, Machine Metrics. So everything from synthetic biology to IoT to CRM applications, and we also looked at lots of fintech. One of the things that I found as I was leaving Mass Ventures was we were starting to see a real rise in the number of companies purporting to be using artificial intelligence and machine learning within their applications to build models and deliver services to companies. And as we were meeting some of these entrepreneurs, not all, but some, there was kind of a lack of systems thinking about what it would mean to put this technology into production and for someone to adopt it and start using their application. And it got me really thinking about what would be the next generation of companies that are needed to support the use of AI at scale in the business environment. And what I mean there is I'm really interested in what I'm calling AI trust and transparency, and the tools and data that we need across an organization, from privacy and governance capabilities, interpretability and explainability, and tools to support developers and data scientists, tools for monitoring and auditing, and tools really for product lifecycle management of these applications, because often they are systems and they are very dependent on where they live within the system. If that you change the processor, you may get different results. If you are building a model and then it's going into hardware, you need to keep those two things in sync, for example, in manufacturing. So I have a working thesis about this. We're raising a seed fund focused in this area of AI trust and transparency. And the thesis is that the market will grow similarly to the way we saw cybersecurity grow over the last 15 years. That as the internet took hold and more network took hold, we had an increasing number of issues along the flow. The other parallel would be to think about this as the way DevOps has evolved to support software development. We'll have a layer of tools and capabilities that develop to support model development. And so I'm really excited that we have with us Slater, who is one of the early adopters in terms of using unstructured data and building solutions for fintech companies. Karim, whose company, when he was he was an EVP at Zest Finance, first began building models to do a better job with underwriting, and then realized that just the trust and transparency element of how you delivered that would be of value to other financial services companies. So he can talk about that. And then Anthony, as Sri mentioned, who's building Monitor for model assurance. So I want to turn it over first to Karim to talk a little bit about the journey of Zest from doing underwriting yourselves to realizing that this would be something that you would deliver a value to others, and how you thought about that.
Thanks, Jennifer. Hi, everyone. Pleasure to be with you this morning. My name's Karim Saleh. A little about me. I've basically spent the last several years applying complex machine learning algorithms to consumer loan underwriting. I started my career kind of working on financial inclusion issues, initially in the nonprofit sector, and then at the US government, and then the last couple of years, several years actually, in kind of Silicon Valley-backed startups. And that gave me kind of visibility into the underwriting practices of some of the kind of quote unquote most prestigious financial institutions in the world. And I was quite surprised to learn that even at the commanding heights of finance, most underwriting practices are still quite rudimentary. They use linear logistic regression models, 20 to 50 variables, largely not great at underwriting kind of borrowers at the bottom of the economic pyramid whose credit bureau histories are often messy, missing, or wrong. And so 5 years ago, I set out on a journey to find people who were kind of working on interesting ways of modernizing underwriting. And I landed at a Silicon Valley startup that had been founded by Google's former chief information officer. And he was lending for his own balance sheet. And his insight was that complex AI ensembles, I'm talking about ensembles of tree-based methods and neural networks and support vector machines, that use 10x the number of variables as are currently used by conventional underwriting models. Those complex AI ensembles, particularly for hard-to-score borrowers, dramatically outperformed conventional underwriting techniques. The problem with complex ensembles is that they are very hard to explain and validate, which makes them very, very difficult to use in high-stakes applications like lending, healthcare, predictive policing, any domain where you really need to understand why the robot did what it did. If you're like Uber and you're trying to optimize the path from point A to point B, it's a relatively low stakes decision. Maybe you can rely on a black box because if the car takes a wrong left turn someplace, it might cost somebody some time and a little bit of money, but it's not a life threatening decision. But in some of these high stakes applications like consumer finance, you really can't just throw your hands up and say, well, I don't know why we approved this person or denied that person. The robot just told us to do it. So we started working on and applying methods to explain black box algorithms. And that was really, really eye-opening because once you can see the variables that these models are taking into account and to what extent, as well as the ability for seemingly benign variables to interact in ways that encode information, you start to realize, whoa, these algorithms are super predictive, but they also have the potential to be really unfair. And in lending, the models can be unfair for a variety of reasons, mostly related to data availability, data representativeness, and multivariate interactions, which can proxy for race. The good news is that like every day, some enterprising mathematician comes up with some great method to explain and debias models. Microsoft has an open source package, IBM has an open source package, Google has an open source package. What's surprising to me, frankly, is that these methods of increasing machine learning, explainability, and fairness aren't in more widespread use in the financial services industry. I think that is going to change. I think that, if there's first of all, I think that just the cultural moment demands increased fairness and transparency and trust from financial institutions, especially as it becomes clear the kind of disproportionate impact that the pandemic is having on minority borrowers and women. And I think if there's a change in the US government this fall, the likelihood of kind of fair lending enforcement and an emphasis on AI transparency and fairness issues is likely to increase dramatically. So I've said a lot. Why don't I pause there?
Yeah, if you would pause, I want to turn for a second to Slater, because one of the ways that I look at this problem is to look at it as sort of, you've got problems on the data side and how you manage data. You've got problems of the build of the algorithm and can you provide explanation. We've got problems that Anthony's going to address about once you put it in production, how do you keep track that you're doing the right things and that you have a trail for audit. But you really think about this in terms of how do you design the system for it. And you recently published a paper looking at this in Nature. He can send you the link.
Sorry, no, that is absolutely not my
FDA
paper.
med devices.
No, sorry. Big disclaimer.
Miscorrected.
That is absolutely not my paper. I did not write that paper.
Oh, you didn't write the paper?
No.
You referenced the paper to me as a method that you think about. Let me correct that.
Yeah, I mean, let me just maybe do my introduction, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Yeah, so my name is Slate Victorov. I am at Indico Data Solutions. I'm the founder of Indico. I'm currently the CTO of Indico. I'm also an executive in residence at 406 Ventures, which is kind of a large Series A targeted venture capitalist firm in Boston. Big focus on kind of healthcare and data. My background in this space, Indico was kind of, one of the very first companies to take modern deep learning methods and start moving them into production in a way that was easily accessible. We started doing that in sort of 2012 and 2013, kind of as ImageNet came out. And our really big question, right, was sort of asking, in a lot of ways, how effective these methods were, right? How exactly we were going to ensure that we were doing things the right way, right? And I would say that is kind of the really simple mission that has driven our whole view of explainability. So I'll say my personal view, right, is that I think the big issue with explainability is that everyone means something different when they say explainability. And when Jennifer Jordan is talking about system level explainability, my personal view and the way that we've built this into Indico is by saying that, and actually Karim made a really, really excellent point with the variables that are proxies for race. I think that if I had to kind of say the one thing that is my fundamental view on explainability, it's that I think people chase model level explainability when that will not give them the outcomes that they're looking for. I'll give a really simple example. Let's say that we've got a model that looks at zip codes and predicts some financial variable, right? Whether that is consumer risk, right? Or an appraisal modifier, right? Whether that's more or smaller. Most people don't realize, but even an OLS style model by looking at a zip code can actually infer race to kind of a disturbingly high degree. And so the reason I use that example is because no amount of introspection you do on the model that goes from zip code to that financial metric will show bias. Right, it is literally impossible to find that at the model level, right? So my point is that model level explainability is important, and it's fundamentally a tool for researchers to explain what their model is doing internally, right? But separate from that, the questions that we really, really need to be able to answer is not, this prediction came out as 8 because we set K in our KNN model to 3, and kind of pat ourselves on the back, right? what we need to understand is, okay, where exactly does this perform in production? Where is this going to stand up? Where is this not going to stand up? How was this trained? How do we make sure that there was no test train contamination, right? So when I talk about explainability and system level explainability, that is really what I'm talking about, is saying that the entire process from start to finish, from your data gathering to your test train splits to the deployment to any ongoing training, right? Which I think that we've heard a lot about from Karim, and Anthony is going to continue to kind of delve into. I do think you really need a full solution there to say that you've delivered on explainability. So that's my spiel.
Cool. Anthony, you want to tell a little bit about Monitor and how you pick right up on a theme that Slater just talked about, which is how do you keep track of this stuff afterwards for the business perspective, and how does that information get back so that we make sure we're doing the right things, because this stuff won't be just surfaced by model level explanation, but we have to look across the whole continuum.
So, hi, Anthony Habaib, co-founder, and I am the of Monitor, but I'm the co-founder and CEO of Monitor. Yeah, so I view the world, actually for a minute, think about doctors that make their oath to do no harm. In many ways, we have a technical audience on this call. You are model builders, right? You're going to build a model that you're not going out there with nefarious means, right? But you understand things can happen. And there are ways that you will try to instrument your model and your system to identify those mistakes and issues. But there's also an intentionality that not just you, but the people around you need to have in terms of building appropriate controls around the process and systems that work together to cause an end result. And if you think about that idea of a relationship between process and systems, the idea of having controls against these risks is not foreign in regulated industries. And there's a really massive industry that already exists to try and create these confidences in these validations of their controls. And that idea is called assurance. And machine learning has very unique nuances, as people on this call and this panel understand, in terms of its technical architecture and its way of either showing or not showing how it reaches conclusions. The elements in the tech stack involved in getting to an end result. Should I give Anthony Habaib a life insurance policy? Does this patient have cancer? Should we give this patient this medication? Should I give Anthony a loan or not give him a loan? Should we hire Anthony? Yes or no? Those are really important consequential decisions that, yes, you should build appropriate controls around a system, but you should also have an intentional process through which you go from how you decided to even use a model, how you documented what the model's supposed to do, and then when this model is in production, to where Jennifer kicked off, what visibility does this extended group of individuals who care about the performance and the compliance and the efficacy of this model, how do we collaborate to understand what the system is doing and appropriately manage the risks that I'm worried about? And so really specifically, we're building a company that provides software that is meant to enable that exact problem, right? That lets a model developer focus on, actually, O'Reilly did a great article a couple of weeks ago that you all might want to check out, which sort of, I think, reinforces a point that I feel strongly about. The machine learning space is not going to be owned by a monolithic application. Like, no single company is going to own machine learning. You're going to figure out which model type is the right model to solve your problem. And somebody else in a business might have some other way to approach a problem. But your company needs one way of building compliance and controls around those things. And so we're building a software that is meant to connect to any model and to start to enable really users around you as the model builders to have the enablement of control and management of compliance and mitigation of risks that they worry about around your model. So for me, explainability is an important piece of a broader assurance framework. Managing bias is an important piece around this broader assurance framework, and that's our view of the world.
I want to throw something out for all of you that I think is really interesting to me. When I'm out talking to potential customers for these applications, NLPs, I meet sort of two extremes of the world, and then kind of a messy middle. And the two extremes are, we have been on the forefront of AI. We are building models, and we've basically, so think about the main platform AI providers, the Facebooks of the world. they've been building models with an emphasis on performance and accuracy and speed to deploy, right? And then scale. Like, can they scale them as quickly as they can? And there's when I talk to those people, feels like there's very little infrastructure to support responsibility of the AI or to support assurance. On the other end are people who've been within the regulated model industry, who've been building linear models predominantly and using some elements of machine learning. And they have a process for testing those models and validating those models. And some of those people feel like they've got it all dialed in. And that this way of doing AI or deep learning is not that new, and they don't really need to change their process at all. And I would love to have, Shri, this is one for you to chime in on too. All of you have been practitioners and are meeting people in the marketplace. I'd love for you to talk about what you see in terms of the range of those temperatures of nothing to, oh, we've got this all locked down. And then how you've addressed it.
Yeah, so I'd actually like to make an assertion because I think that in my experience, there's sort of an inverse relationship between the people that think they understand it and the people that do actually understand it. And I think the example that you used about Facebook was perfect, right? Because I think that when you talk to someone at Facebook, right, and you talk to them about explainability and insurance, right, you will often get that kind of like, oh, well, you know, I don't know exactly what you mean by that. Right. You know, I don't know if we have anything like that. But when you actually look at the systems that they've got, right, their runtime monitoring of these models, right, that exists, right, rigorous benchmarking to determine exactly what the bias is amongst different areas, right, like this exists. I think a really telling example is that if you look at AJL's work, right, they went and they basically examined and they looked at IBM, right? And I think IBM is a really clear example of someone that certainly makes a lot of noise about being on the right side of that spectrum, saying they've got a lot of assurance, right? And then you've got Google that I think you literally used as the example of the far left side. But what they found is that Google was something like 20 times less biased than IBM was at exactly the same task. And I think that is a really great example of why I think system level explainability is so important, right? I think that these new models, there are a lot of really important lessons to be learned from assurance. And I think a lot of that existing space should be reused, but not 100% of it. And I think one particular place where the focus does really need to shift is that I don't think that it's right for someone in an explainability space to assert, oh, they should be using an OLS model for this, right? Or they should be using logistic regression, or they should be using X or Y or Z, right? I think that in my view, if you've got an explainability framework that doesn't apply across all model types, then you don't really have an explainability framework.
I'll probably, kind of address the second part of what you were mentioning, Jennifer. And I mean, just working in this area for so many years, and we came from a model validation perspective. This was pre-machine learning, right? So this was when we had the stress testing frameworks with the post-2008, you know, the SR 11.7, everyone having to go about and build out frameworks for model risk management within various companies. Mm-hmm. So I think there is this, you know, complete discrepancy in terms of understanding of what the industry needs. And many a times the technology vendors are pushing what they've innovated into the financial services industry. And without an understanding of, just to be, you know, blatantly honest, the technical sophistication of the folks who are actually managing processes within the financial industry. Just bringing in a couple of data scientists or machine learning engineers into the workflow is not going to change the process within the industry. There are, you know, people in multiple layers making decisions. There are ownerships. There's way in which things are done in the industry. And machine learning is trying to make an impact in two levels, right? One is on the automation space, wherein you could say, well, humans are doing this. If we learn what humans are doing, classic example, NLP, you know, you need lawyers to be reading this and extracting certain keywords. You have certain reports, and we are trying to extract certain keywords and maybe extract some sentiments. Overall, how is my customer service doing? Do I really need a customer service rep sitting down and answering password reset questions? All those kinds of questions, AI and machine learning can easily address, and that's where you can kind of see a lot of adoption happening. On the other hand, when you have traditional statistical models and you have the quants, typically physicists, engineers, people who came with economics background and they built out the whole thing. There is obviously, the financial data is not like, your recommendation system data or computer vision data, wherein you have, this is my ground truth. I'm gonna try and build out my models towards this ground truth, and I can explain it in various ways to get there, right? So a lot of discussions which I've seen is primarily geared towards, well, you guys don't know what you're doing. Let me build this thing for you and give it to you, and you will be able to do your job better. And then if the pushback is, well, we're not understanding what you're doing. So, oh, we have this explainability suite, which will help you explain better. So ultimately, they think that the people who are sitting there are gatekeepers trying to cater to somebody else's need, and they need to do their job better. And that's not the case, right? They have fiduciary responsibility. They have, organizational constraints. They have various aspects. And I don't think the industry is there yet to basically take these solutions, and if you build a better widget and adopt it, it's going to happen, right?
Yeah,
so we are seeing multiple phases of evolution, and I think explainability is still scratching the surface in the whole aspect. And the concerns are real. The concerns about bias is real. The concerns about not being able to explain is real. So that's why we are kind of coming from a framework perspective, wherein, well, these are all the things you already have, and these are all the things which are coming in. So how do you integrate this? You can't just have two parallel processes saying, this is for traditional models, this is for machine learning models. That's never going to happen. Or you cannot replace the traditional workflow by saying, let's kind of build in this because we have figured it out. We have model validation, we have all these reports, we have all these things happening, and everybody in the Valley likes this, so you should also be adopting. That kind of thing is not going to work too. So
you were selling into this market. Tell me a little bit about what you found as you made that shift from doing the underwriting to helping people with their underwriting models and providing explanation.
Yeah, I like very much many of the things that Slater said, but in particular, the comment that, he often found that there's an inverse relationship between the people who claim to know what they're doing explainability wise and actually do. My experience has run the spectrum that you kind of identified, Jennifer. I mean, 5 years ago, we started working with Chinese technology companies, and frankly, that was the Wild West. They were very, very advanced technologically. How good their enterprise-wide risk controls were, frankly, I don't know. I suspect substantially weaker than the ones at Google and Facebook. And I think that probably has changed a bit in China too, as some of the excesses of the peer-to-peer lending market became quite frothy. The other end of the spectrum is, I'll call on financial institutions who'll say, well, we use a machine learning algorithm to derive certain features, and then we shoehorn those features back into a logistic regression because it allows us to, run our existing model validation and compliance process. And that feels to me like the triumph of, form over substance, because do you really understand those you get the appearance of explainability because you can kind of look at the coefficients of your logistic regression and understand what it's doing. But do you really understand those machine-derived features? My guess is not.
It's like you've got a billion parameters generating one feature, and then you pay attention to the one coefficient you multiply that feature by after the fact, right?
So I tend to think that Slater is also right, that what is needed, I tend to talk a lot about model level explainability, but Slater is absolutely right. I mean, what is needed is enterprise-wide controls that are probably principles-based, that demand that we're agnostic with respect to the modeling technique that you use, but you gotta damn well make sure that whatever technique you use, you're validating that model in a method that's appropriate to the technique. and then governing that model in a manner that assures that that model does not pose a threat to the safety and soundness of the financial system or to consumers.
Amen.
I want to call on Anthony here, because that feels like that was such a tee up for what you're building. And the other part that is interesting to me is that some of your initial conversations have been not specifically with banks as financial services companies, but with insurers. And what strikes me about that is insurers also highly regulated, but a different process of using models than what we have in financial services. And so maybe an openness there, or an understanding that they really don't have the same assurance structure, and they need to build fast. And so I'd love you to talk about what you're seeing there in the engagement, both on the regulatory side and on the customer side.
Yeah, one thing that strikes me as well is we sort of think about the word principles is important, because even Brookings Institute did something the other day that talked about the idea of soft law, right? And the need for AI to have soft law, which are these sort of principles that govern without explicit mandates. And I think that was a pretty smart piece that you guys might want to check out. But something that we think a lot about is you should sort of, in a proper assurance or governance around these systems, you should sort of have three things. You should have context, you should have verifiability, and you should have objectivity, right? And how those things get manifested into your system or into your process are really important. And banks have done, I mean, Sri can speak to this, right? Like model validation, model risk management, right? I mean, Karim has sold into this. That's not a new idea in banking at all. Been doing it for decades. And that's actually where their vulnerability exists if they were using machine learning, but they are not anywhere near machine learning making a last mile credit decision. Now go to insurance potentially, or healthcare, where they are laggards in terms of investment in data and in machine learning. Banking was way ahead of data, and therefore can be ahead on machine learning. Insurance and healthcare are catching up on data, and that time span will be faster than it was in banking because of the advancements. But now they are saying, I could transform how I provide term life insurance to a consumer, right? Any of you that have gone through a term life insurance or in a life insurance process, it takes forever. But if you're 25 years old, single, and do nothing risky in your life, why can't you offer me a policy on the spot? You could build a model that effectively evaluates that consumer and provides, but that's not even how insurance works today. Like you literally need to
did just start doing that actually about a year ago.
Yeah, so like
recently.
There's a company out of California that has been doing a lot around term life that just did, I think, a Series B, and some other entrants into this category, because there's great disruption potential. And in healthcare, there's great disruption potential. But these are really important decisions that impact our lives. And back to context, what a consumer wants to know about that decision versus what the compliance manager wants to know versus the technical conversation that Slater and Karim were having around technical coefficients of an outcome. Completely different users in the context of what an explanation means to them is very different. And as you are building and deploying models, it's really important that you think about context of the users that will be affected by that model and what they need to know, and that they have some degree of confidence. There's an objectivity in how that understanding explanation was provided, or how bias was confirmed or not confirmed. That was objectively done. So the person who built the model isn't the one saying my model is perfect. And that there's also this ability for someone to verify. And that's also, it's a different domain, in my opinion, from explainability, right? But the literal ability to do some element of reperformance or verification or like validation, what this thing did can be done again, is actually also really powerful. So I hope that's sort of connected.
Such a great point you made there.
Hey, Sri, we've got our first comment in the comments section from Jigar Vakaria, who's writing that traditionally quantitative asset managers using multivariate linear regression that explain risk return have done a decent job with system level explainability, because the quant asset managers have a fiduciary responsibility. Typically the models are built in-house, teams are STEM members, economists, and the members all have domain level knowledge, which is another aspect of explainability. Yeah, so I think that's a really interesting comment from Jigger in the face of we're starting to see the place both of the internal teams and the sort of democratization where people are selling applications into companies, or like the insurance company you just referred to, Anthony, are innovating in the space and may not have all this other domain knowledge involved.
Jennifer, a quick point on this. This is almost a perfect example of that. Like, I know what I'm doing, and Jigger is right. If you go into a high frequency trading desk or a bank that's doing some things with quant, you don't execute a trade unless some of these things exist. Like, we're talking about billions of dollars of movement, right? But there's a sophistication and a type of model being used there very intentionally, because you can't afford to not have some of those visibilities when you're transacting. Like, what's the company in Jersey City 8 years ago that completely collapsed within an hour because of they sort of went a little bit further? Knight Street, I think is what it is, or Knight Capital, right?
Yeah, that was it, Knight Capital.
Yeah, so like I think Jigger's totally right. But this thing is not what some of these not pure quant large corporations that are excited to use these models to make decisions, they don't have this.
Yeah, and I would
problem space.
Yeah, I agree with that very much. And I think I would go a step further, because I think that, obviously there are a small number of, very sophisticated quants. I think, Two Sigma is kind of the perennial example of this, that have, been doing this for years, right? And they've got a really good setup for what I would assert is a very, very particular problem setup, right? And just to speak to the quant world, right, let me just give a couple of examples that I think folks have thrown out, but I would consider sort of the absolute base necessity for kind of a responsible setup, right? And I think hearing these, you'll realize these basically don't exist at most companies, right? So number one, Anthony, like you said, the person validating the model has to be a different person than the one building the model. Seems basic, very rare.
Doesn't exist at Google today, based on a friend of mine's experience, for example.
It depends on the group, right? Not certainly system-wide.
They didn't have a QA system that was separate from the model building team yet. That they knew it was on the roadmap, but it wasn't there yet. Just a year ago. So
that's one piece, really basic, right? Number two, and this is, kind of the most basic thing anyone in ML would say, separating your test and your training sets, right? You would be surprised. There are companies out there in the market today that have a policy of advertising accuracies on their training data, right? So I think, and the third thing that I would kind of throw out there, right, is the idea of having consistent testing. And I think specifically on the quant side, one example of this is sort of regression testing, where often, everyone has their own different Excel spreadsheet, everyone does the regression testing in a different way, and people don't often think about those things as explainability, right? But when we talk about system level explainability, you have to say, like, every single one of those places, that is where error and bias enters your system, right? Like when my regression test is different from Joe's regression test, right? Suddenly we can't actually compare those two. And I think that in some industries, and specifically in kind of the very top tier quants, they do a really, really good job. But I think that if you look sort of across fintech, I don't even see those basic principles being adhered to.
Oh, I think there's real variance that I've seen across domain within the organization. So, for example, people charged on the consumer and marketing side may have a different set of experience and strictures around this stuff. And now they're starting to have access to tools that would let them very aggressively and precisely personalize offers to people. And as you're doing that, you're starting to walk into the places where you have additional regulatory risk. And you may not realize it because their knowledge of building those models is not the same as the guy who's sitting there executing trades, right? Ironically, I'm just going to put some fear in your hearts, or some like light bulbs. We're talking within the context of fintech, but of course, data scientists are in demand across the world right now for these issues and across verticals. And it is continually surprising to me how this lack of systems level thinking hits people, and then they realize it and have to scramble to catch up. So the example that I'll give you is and where you meet what you care about in terms of explanation or responsibility or security around your AI system varies by by vertical, right? So Tesla Model 1 car didn't take into account, as they initially developed the models, that the sensor data, the sensor hardware information needed to be tracked with the model build. Because when you go to the next production run of the vehicle and you use potentially a different sensor from a different manufacturer, or you upgraded the sensor, you now have to go back and retrain the model.
Yeah.
And in the first version of the Tesla, this was an issue that they hadn't tackled. Now there are companies that are coming out of, say, chip design, like Fortelix, that are really focused on developing verification and validation models for the autonomous sensor systems in cars that are separate from the tracking, but both the life cycle management and those verification systems were initially missing. Right? Model 2, recognition of the problem, total rebuild from the ground up to get to a place where they can track some of these things.
And
right?
let's just
my understanding, and I don't know them personally, but that's my understanding from talking to people there.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Jennifer. I mean, when you have automobiles and you're building a product which is going to serve millions, you can definitely build in that amount of rigor to make sure that the V&V process, as they are called, kind of are incorporated. One of the challenges with the financial industry is the business models are so diverse, and there are so many asset classes, so many sizes. I mean, if you go to, like a traditional Wells Fargo, they have the infrastructure, they have the technology teams, they have the model validation team, they have the separation of responsibilities, and they can kind of, build out that level of infrastructure. But talk about a $200 million bank somewhere in the Midwest, and they don't have that level of technical sophistication, and they still want to be using some of these models, right? So I think
you'd be looking at Nest and Indico to help them, right?
Absolutely, and that's where we have to think about context, because if you do not have solutions which are meant for specific contexts, and otherwise we are just going to be talking either too high level, wherein we all agree that there is going to be some process required, some amount of vetting of each one of these system components required. If you kind of talk at the data scientist level, we can start talking about the specific terms like, Lime, Shapley scores. You can kind of, get to the very nitty-gritty of things, right? And that's where this whole area of algorithmic auditing is becoming more and more popular. And if you look at the spectrum of people who are really busy validating the models, it's not the companies frantically trying to hire model validators internally. They're not just outsourcing it into like saying, give me that product which is going to do these things for me. It's the consulting companies.
Yeah, I think it grows services in a similar way to what we saw with cyber.
Right. Because you had to bring in that context, the domain expertise, and structure the problem in a particular way, and then figure out, because ultimately humans are going to be making decisions whether to let this model go into production or not. And even if you give them all the reports saying, well, here are all the green check marks, if you don't understand what those check marks actually mean, you're not just going to say another system validated it, and we are going to trust this other system, and we're going to go and get this model into production. It has to be someone sitting there and saying, well, I understand that this is the amount of risk I'm taking if something bad happens, and I've done this amount of due diligence, and I'm going to be able to bless this model, or at least understand that these are the mitigation measures which are in place, right? So there is that human in the loop element which is significantly required in explainability. Right now, it's not an automation problem.
Well, and it's
building the right
translation issue too. Like I've seen companies that are sort of drag and drop explainability, apply the technique that works for you. Like I said, there'll be vertical specialization here.
Absolutely, yep.
But that's not enough to solve the sort of need that Anthony addresses, for example, or that Karim is addressing, or even Slater's talked to about making the technical to business level translation of what does this stuff mean and what should I be thinking about.
Yeah. I think
we are at the. Go ahead, Slater.
I was going to say, I think, because one of the things I really loved about what you were saying, Sri, is sort of, I think one of the archetypes that's actually really destructive to the data science world is kind of the lone data scientist in a corner. right? And sort of when you talk about that $200 million bank, the thing that immediately jumps to my head is, the company went and hired 3 data scientists and sort of stuck them in a corner, right? And I think that unfortunately it happens really, really commonly. And I think a lot of people do have this idea of, I'm kind of going to leave the data scientist in the corner and, like make the number go up, right? And I think what I really think is that people need to respect how hard it is to really try to create an AI advantage, right? And say, like, if I'm going to have a single person there, what that single person really needs to be responsible for is orchestrating other things. Because to build AI, like, it's not just someone building scikit-learn models in the corner, right? It has to be more organizational than that.
Actually, one thing to throw on that actually connects back to Jiggy's comment too. The people that own the budgets and will be making decisions about investments in ML and AI are not going to be able to engage at a technical level with the team that is building those things. And that is terrifying. Like, one of my biggest values to Monitar is I am not the data scientist. And so I have been the P&L business line owner that says, go team, go build this. Imagine you are a multi-billion-dollar business line owner that is now entrusting those data scientists to build you an application to make critical decisions for your business. And you feel no personal empowerment to be able to know, is that application doing what it's supposed to do? Have they built the proper controls in place? Do they have somebody objectively looking at their system? Can I take a peek now and then if I wanted to? Those are very real, like, emotional things that every person involved in building a model should at least empathize with and understand. Your enablement to build, deploy, and grow this thing that you want to build is going to have to think about that stakeholder. And it's really important to sort of develop that muscle and skill, I think, to engage with those people and make them invested, right, in this overall process.
C curve can be beyond what you can communicate to the business, right?
Yeah.
Totally. So we did not leave enough Q&A time, Sri. We've got 6 minutes if you want to give.
Absolutely. So I think just to, about people who are listening, please type your questions in the chat window and we'll try and get to as many questions as possible. This has been an invigorating discussion for me. So I'm just kind of taking notes as we are speaking. And because, many a times I kind of work with the C-level folks who are, basically he's looking at the problem and saying, look, I have a team of data scientists. I have my model validation team. I'm setting a whole, a governance policy. I have my different lines of business to take care of. I'm looking at model risk. I'm looking at reputation risk. I'm also accounting for all the other things. And for them, we are kind of starting to, look at the policy level decisions that needs to be made. How do you kind of, integrate these aspects into the whole process? And that's where we are primarily focused on the education front, because it's education at multiple levels, not just the technology piece, but also the process piece, the integration piece, and the whole, just to even set the realistic expectations that you're not just kind of buying Lego blocks and building upon things, right?
Yeah, you're not.
But this has been a fascinating discussion. So please, if people have questions, please type them into either the Q&A panel or in the chat window. Actually, I had a question for you, Jennifer.
Okay.
So, some of the valuations are just crazy when I see people investing. And the latest one, and I shouldn't be saying this, Bumble, $6 to $8 billion. They're going for an IPO. So you've been looking at AI and machine learning models at all levels. How do you value an AI company? And where is the IP? And how do you kind of position the hockey stick, the proverbial hockey stick? And what fascinates you with the business model, with the technology? And how do you kind of evaluate it? Because I presume you are also not, the data scientist like Slater, who's kind of looking at ROC curves, right? So you're kind of looking at a bigger picture.
Well, I think I don't know the Bumble example explicitly, but what I would tell you is that, and I usually work very, very early stage because I'm a seed investor, not you've gotten to some degree of traction. But I think what you see is that there are a few companies like Lemonade, Bumble, that have found a way to both outperform on the risk profile and outperform on the reaching the customer element, right? And a lot of these are applications that have some face to the consumer. And when those things have taken off recently, they've achieved very large valuations because their growth is relatively quick. I think we've seen a slower path to ramp on the enterprise side. And of course, anybody in financial services right now is looking at it's not it is. It's a Tableau filing and saying, wait a minute, 15 years, several $1 billion to get to $700 million of revenue. What were we doing, right? And yet a tremendous amount of value has been unlocked by those applications. And the question is, can they get their model and their sales and marketing and operating expenses in line, that they have the right kind of EBITDA as a public company? That's a somewhat different question. But I think we're going to continue to see strong investment where people fear there's differentiation or where there's been some rapid traction. There's also likely to be some reckoning. There are early stage companies that have raised quite a lot of money at relatively high valuations, even in this AI trust and transparency space. And it's going to be incumbent on them between now and their next round to rack up the sales. And that really depends on what is the appetite within organizations for help in building responsible AI.
So the other question I had was actually going back to what Anthony was saying before about this O'Reilly article, right? There is definitely, from a technology perspective, saying, well, we need specialized solutions. You can't have just a platform having all the tools integrated into it. But I was talking to someone in the financial industry recently, and they were saying, well, the industry is not going to be like taking all these piecemeal products and integrating them and building out a whole chain. So they're just going to wait and see a platform which incorporates many of it. All of them need not be at 100% level. They will look for the things which are extremely important for them, and they'll rank them. Okay, I need a 9 in here, I need a 9 in here, kind of a thing. But then for certain elements, they'll say, you know what, that's not too important for us. If it becomes too important, we'll buy something else, kind of a thing. They'll start from there. So, I came from Indica a long time ago, and we were building a platform and then looking at use cases wherein you could potentially think. So how do you look at the world when, as startups, you do not have the budget to build out the whole stack? So you had to think about partnerships, horizontal integration across multiple products, but you also have to think about, well, what differentiates you? Because you're so, competing in, from an algorithmic perspective, from an integration perspective, from a use case perspective. How do you look at the world when, as a startup, you're trying to build out things? And maybe you can, this is probably a question more for Anthony, Slater, and Karim on, from an entrepreneurship perspective, how do you kind of look at the world when you're either being contended with like, well, do you integrate with all these platforms versus what's so unique and differentiating about you, and why should they come to your particular product?
So, I mean, there's a lot in there. I think that there are. So let me maybe say two things, because I think there's the one just generic question of like, how do you build a startup, right? So let's maybe put that to the side compared to the first question I asked, you think, which is, the question of sort of a single product for, the full stack of explainability versus multiple products. And, you're fundamentally correct that when you look at any space, no company is going to become sort of smart enough in the space to really intelligently put these pieces together to build a full solution, right? It functionally doesn't happen. But, this is how kind of most other technical industries go as well. If you look at cloud adoption or mobile adoption or testing, right, it's exactly the same in every single case, right? Which is the SIs come in, right, and where someone really wants to adopt, they figure out how they're going to stitch together the particular solutions to get them something in a full way, right? As a startup, really what you have to focus on is making sure that you've got one thing that is going to deliver enough value to make them say they have to be a part of that bundle for us.
Cool.
Yeah.
Any finishing thoughts from Anthony and Karim?
Yeah. Sri, I would take that question. So Slater is building a direct product with some explainability in it. In the context of this meeting, I would take your question in terms of this O'Reilly thing I mentioned earlier. There are like 3 companies. Actually, there's more. There's probably 4 or 5. Like you have Microsoft, you have Amazon, you have IBM, you have potentially SAS is something that nobody ever talks about, but is absolutely applicable in this conversation, right? There's some companies who would like to say, I can be the monolithic solution that can give you everything you need, right? And Amazon, to the whole, if you want to do everything, they do all the pieces of this decently, right? Like you can use SageMaker, you can use their cloud services. They provide some monitoring around the application and around the models and some tooling around visibility, right? But for those folks building the models, you talk to any data scientist, generalizability and the agility to pick the right model for the problem is going to continue to be the need of this entire space. And so if you are building a product like Slater, you're going to build the right technical methods to solve that problem the best way possible. And you are not going to sacrifice solving that problem with the best accuracy for having some of these other things. You will figure out how to stitch in those pieces yourself. And so the prevalence of open source and the ability, frankly, Python being 95% of how a lot of these things are being done, that creates a certain connectivity in this larger space. That is a bet we are at least making as a company is, as long as we play with the disparate elements in a clean way, we want the data scientists to have the agility to build a model that achieves the best confidence and outcome and accuracy for the problem they're trying to solve, and then give them tooling that gives those other users, back to the point around context and objectivity, that gives these other people the visibility they need.
As an investor, I would say it's hard to think of any sector where the winner was a platform to begin with. Typically what you see is someone owning really, really well a really, really hard part of the problem to solve that's the highest value for a particular vertical, a particular type of customer, a particular problem, and then winning there, expanding as fast as they can across that domain, and then expanding where the next need is for that part, that sector. And from there, they grow into a platform. And I think that's one of the reasons that I kind of use that cybersecurity analogy, because you can look back and say, okay, we all remember when we had a watch guard, and then watch guard, well, maybe we don't, because I'm pretty old. Watch guard didn't, wasn't enough anymore because the first DNS attacks were attacking. And then it wasn't DNS anymore, it was malware. And then it was DNS again, and then it was endpoint attacks. And at each point along that path, they were point tools until they began to be aggregated into platforms that became SecOps. DevOps looks really similar, and I think we see something similar here in terms of an AI application layer, an AI tools layer, and then a set of tools and techniques to support trust and transparency, and eventually security.
Karim, you have 1 minute before we can close the session.
I think Anthony, Slater, and Jennifer have covered it very, very well. The only point I'll make is on the earlier question about kind of investments in startups, and I sort of agree with Jennifer that at least in the enterprise space, it's not at all clear to me that the economics of a kind of B2B enterprise AI explainability companies is going to be anything like that of traditional software companies. There's a great piece out of Andreessen written by Martin Casado and I think Matt Bornstein talking
on the
about
unit economics, yeah?
Yeah, about basically once you contend with the data complexity and the model complexity and the edge cases, that you're probably looking at businesses that are much more in the if you're good, 50 to 60% margin range rather than, the 70 to 85% margin range that traditional, I think, venture-backed software companies, especially in the consumer space.
And do you think that's because of the data burden as a differentiation?
I think it's data complexity, but I think it also has a lot. You just need humans in the loop,
Yes.
especially. Yeah.
I think people also really underestimate the compute cost, right?
Yes.
And that was one of the big points in that article. Is that an example I'll give is that a lot of people like to take one document, feed it through multiple different OCR solutions, and then re-aggregate it. They don't realize that once you've got 3 or 4 OCR solutions there, your unit economics are already inverted.
I think one of the things that'll be interesting is to see how stuff translates across verticals. So people who are building for the edge, truly edge and edge learning applications, are developing techniques that let you do some physics and vector analysis on your data so you can reduce the data to small data sets. This is certainly an area where Fintech,
this is a whole other conversation, Jennifer.
right now is really working hard, right?
Yeah.
That stuff has the capability in the future to really reduce some of those costs, and hopefully also will make this systems greener, which is a whole other topic stream maybe for another day.
Absolutely. And when we kind of kick off the fall series of workshops, we'll definitely factor that in. Green investing, green AI, and I think there are already some talk about like responsible AI, not only from the perspective of the AI itself, but also like how do you make sure that it's efficient enough? So just to kind of close today's session, thank you so much for this engaging discussion. This was fantastic. In fact, I think I learned a lot more, in today's session, and I should have had the session early on so that we could have kind of taken various themes and kind of discussed throughout the summer school. So for people who are, looking for, some of the recordings and the prior sessions which we had a couple of demos, some slides and video, so it's all available on q.academy. I'll be sharing these slides. You just need to use the code QSummerSchool so that you get access to all the demos and the slides and the videos on the platform. And next week we're going to have a discussion on validation, primarily for neural network models, and we have 2 fascinating speakers, Yar Kainatz, who I've known for a really long time. So he used to be a big MATLAB fan. He has written a lot of books on primarily the Q side of for quants who are knowing the difference between the P and the Q quants. He's primarily looking at the Q side of the story and integrating model risk and machine learning models. And he's going to share his perspectives on how do you validate neural network models. And Ben Steiner, who is at BNP, a good friend, and he and I, we have shared multiple audiences, and also we have spoken at multiple events wherein we have discussed this whole notion of model risk management for machine learning models. And he comes from a perspective of a practitioner, and what does it mean to validate these kinds of neural network models. And we're going to have a fascinating discussion next week, and that's going to be a 1.5-hour session because they're both going to be talking about their specific research, one from an academic / perspective of different kinds of models, but Ben is going to primarily talk about adoption, and then we're going to have a fireside chat. So that's in store next week. And I've also shared what I call as the new Decalogue, which is the paper I'm writing. It's called The 10 Things You Need to Know About Model Governance for AI and Machine Learning Models. And that's been like framework we have been discussing in the course. It's about 10 different things, not just explainability, as you can see, is just one piece of all the 10 pieces. So when you think about responsible AI in an industry setting, you have to think about roles, responsibilities, verification, metrics, inventory, tracking, defining what a model actually means, the various choices, and how do you think about development versus production, data governance and integration of data governance with model governance. So a lot of different components need to be factored in. So I've shared that in case anybody is interested in the longer paper, please do send me an email. So thanks so much for sticking around for a little more than what we had originally promised. I hope you got a lot of this session, and thank you again, speakers. This was a pleasure knowing you all and knowing about your work and and I'm looking forward to hearing more about your companies and how you're going to be changing the world with the solutions you're bringing to the table. And good luck, Jennifer, with the raise of the funds. And once you get enough money, please send some of it our way too. So looking forward to engaging offline, and we will stay in touch. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you, guys. Great conversation. Thanks.
Thank you, Sri. Bye-bye all.
Bye-bye.